The encounter at the station. The scent of stale coffee and disinfectant hung heavily in the air of the police station, mingling with the low murmur of officers behind desks, tapping on keyboards, and shuffling through paperwork. It was a typical Monday morning at the precinct, with nothing out of the ordinary to suggest the events that were about to unfold. Dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, the woman entered with a quiet resolve. She wasn't here to make a scene. She wasn't here to argue or cause trouble. She had come to report a theft that had occurred the previous night. It was a straightforward issue, one that would likely be resolved with minimal fanfare. She had no idea that she was about to be thrust into a confrontation that would shatter everything she knew about this station and herself. Her name was Deja Carter, a woman who had built a reputation for herself, not just in her career, but in her unwavering sense of justice. She had been working in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades, starting as a beat cop and rising through the ranks with sheer determination and a commitment to doing what was right. But in a few days, she would be stepping into a new role, one that no one in the department had expected, a role that would turn the entire precinct upside down. Deja's entrance didn't turn any heads at first. It wasn't unusual to see someone coming in to file a report, even if the presence of a woman in a space dominated by men was often a quiet reminder of the gender dynamics at play. But the quiet confidence in her stride was unmistakable, though it was something only a few in the room would pick up on. She approached the front desk, where Officer Jake Thompson, a middle-aged man with a permanent sneer etched across his face, was flipping through some papers. Thompson was known for his abrasive attitude, a reputation that stretched through the precinct like an unspoken rule. His disdain for authority was legendary, but so was his laziness, and so he often got away with far more than he should have. "Can I help you?" Thompson's voice was sharp, his eyes never leaving the papers in front of him. "I need to file a theft report," Deja said, her voice steady, betraying none of the tension she was starting to feel. She placed a small envelope on the counter, a set of photographs documenting the break-in at her home. "Someone broke into my house last night. They took some personal items." Thompson barely glanced up at her. "You got ID?" he asked, not even bothering to make eye contact. Deja nodded and slid her driver's license across the counter. It wasn't an unusual request, but the officer's indifferent tone, almost dismissive, set off a slight irritation in her chest. She had heard enough about Thompson's reputation to know that he wasn't the kind of officer who bothered with niceties. But she wasn't there to make a scene. She wasn't here to escalate things. She was just here to report a crime. As Thompson picked up her ID, his eyes briefly met hers, and in that brief moment, Deja felt it. The subtle shift in his gaze, the silent assessment. It wasn't just the neutral glance of someone verifying an identity. It was the kind of look that people like Thompson gave when they saw someone they deemed other. She knew what it was. She had seen it many times before. The suspicion, the underlying judgment, the quick dismissal. "Is there anything else?" Thompson muttered, flicking his gaze back to the papers in front of him. "No," Deja replied, her words calm but with an edge that she couldn't quite suppress. "I'd just like to report the theft and move on." Thompson leaned back in his chair, clearly not in any rush to help. "We'll get to it when we get to it," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Not every case needs immediate attention." Deja stood there for a moment, her pulse quickening. She wasn't here to argue. But the casual disdain with which Thompson treated her, the way he had barely acknowledged the situation, had barely acknowledged her, was starting to wear on her nerves. "You have my contact information," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Please let me know when you've made some progress." Thompson didn't even look up from his desk. "Yeah, sure. I'll get to it. Don't worry." She turned to leave, but as she did, she felt a jolt of irritation course through her. This wasn't right. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't just another woman who had wandered into the precinct expecting to be treated like an afterthought. She had earned her place in this world, and she wasn't about to let Thompson, or anyone else, make her feel small. She took a step back. "Excuse me," she said, her voice no longer so controlled. "I don't appreciate how you're treating me." Thompson raised an eyebrow, but still didn't look at her. "What, you gonna lecture me now?" He sneered, his eyes still trained on his desk. "You're not the first to walk in here and try to tell me how to do my job. I'm not lecturing you," Deja said, her fists clenched at her sides. "But I would like some respect. I'm here to report a crime, and I expect to be treated with the same professionalism as anyone else who comes through these doors." Thompson chuckled to himself, a low, mocking sound that filled the room with a quiet tension. "Oh, I see. You're one of those people," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Deja to hear. "Think you can just demand respect 'cause you're a woman, huh? Or maybe 'cause you're black." The words landed with a sickening weight, more piercing than any insult she had ever endured. They were meant to hurt, meant to diminish her, but Deja didn't flinch. She stood her ground, the anger bubbling beneath her skin, but she kept it in check. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice even, her heart pounding in her chest. "But you will." The moment stretched into an unbearable silence, but just before she could say more, something unexpected happened. Thompson grabbed his cup of coffee from the desk, a steaming mug he had been sipping from the entire time, and in one swift motion, he tilted it towards her. Hot liquid splashed across Deja's face in a scalding wave. The burn on her skin was immediate, a searing pain that made her gasp, but it wasn't the pain that shocked her. It was the act itself, the deliberate malice behind it. Thompson hadn't just thrown coffee at her. He had thrown his contempt. The room went quiet as Deja wiped the liquid from her face, her eyes narrowing as the sting of humiliation clawed at her pride. But it was not the first time she had been tested in this way. It wouldn't be the last. She looked at Thompson, her expression calm despite the fury bubbling just beneath the surface. "Consider this a reminder of where you stand," he sneered, a sick smile tugging at his lips. But Deja didn't break. She wouldn't. Not here. Not today. She was about to walk out. This battle might have been lost, but in doing so, she would also walk into something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. Something that would change the course of her life. And his, forever. Little did Thompson know, the woman standing before him was not just any civilian. She was about to become his superior. The officer's mistake. Deja stood motionless in front of the desk, her pulse racing. The weight of Thompson's words hung in the air, sharp and ugly, but she refused to let them crush her. She had heard worse in her career, faced down more dangerous obstacles than a petty, racist cop with a chip on his shoulder. But something about this moment felt different. There was a coldness in the air that she couldn't shake, a deep sense that this was not just a random encounter, but the beginning of something far bigger. Thompson's eyes finally left his papers and locked with hers, but there was no apology, no sign of remorse. Instead, he looked at her with a kind of smirk, like he had just delivered the punchline to a joke that only he understood. Deja felt a flash of anger. Burning, white-hot, but she swallowed it down. This wasn't the time for an outburst. "You think I care about your little complaints," he said, his voice now mocking. "You walk in here, acting like you deserve something special, but you're just like the rest of them." Deja's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle of this encounter. Why was this officer so hell-bent on disrespecting her? It wasn't just the fact that she was a woman. It wasn't even the color of her skin. No, it was something deeper, something personal. Thompson had likely never considered the possibility that the woman standing before him might be more than just another face in the crowd. He had no idea who she was or what she was capable of. And in that moment, Deja made a decision. She was going to show him, not through words, but through actions, through the unwavering resolve that had carried her through her entire career. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. "I'm not leaving until I report the theft," Deja said, her voice steady but firm. She could feel the eyes of the other officers in the room, some watching with interest, others nervously avoiding the tension building between her and Thompson. They were all waiting for something to happen, and something was coming, whether they were ready or not. Thompson's smirk faltered, and in that moment he reached for his coffee. He lifted the cup with slow, deliberate motions, as though he were trying to make some kind of statement. Deja's eyes narrowed as he tilted the cup slightly, the dark liquid swishing around, hot and steaming. The hot liquid splashed across her face in an instant. The shock was immediate, the searing pain a sharp contrast to the icy calm that had settled over her heart. Coffee splattered against her cheek, her jaw, and dripped down onto her blouse. The heat was unbearable, scalding like the sting of an open flame. Her skin burned, but it was the humiliation, the absolute disrespect in his gesture, that truly rattled her. Gasps echoed around the room. Some officers turned their heads, eyes wide, unable to hide their shock. Others remained still, rooted in place, as though afraid to break the silence. Deja blinked against the sting, feeling the burn of the coffee against her skin. But she didn't move. She didn't wipe it away. She stood there, letting the heat settle on her, the steam rising like a slow-burning reminder of the injustice. Thompson sat back in his chair, his chest swelling with satisfaction. "Consider that a reminder," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "of who runs this station." Deja's heart was pounding, but her gaze remained locked on Thompson's. There was a moment of stillness, a charged silence that seemed to stretch forever. Deja could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, some with sympathy, others with skepticism, and a few with outright disdain, but she wasn't concerned with them. She was focused on one thing: the man sitting before her, believing he had the upper hand. And then something shifted. The quiet resolve she had carried with her for years began to solidify into something stronger, something unshakable. This wasn't just about a disrespectful officer. This wasn't just about the theft she had come to report. This was about everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. The life she had built, the dreams she had chased, and the injustices she had battled along the way. She wasn't going to let him win. Not now. Not ever. With a slow, deliberate motion, Deja took a step forward, her eyes still locked on Thompson's, and wiped the hot coffee from her face with the back of her hand. She didn't flinch at the burn. She didn't show any sign of weakness. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice calm, but with a quiet intensity that made Thompson hesitate. "And you'll regret this moment. You'll regret underestimating me." Thompson's smirk faltered. For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had expected her to react, expected her to break down, to lash out in fury. But instead, she stood there, unwavering, like a storm ready to unleash, only biding her time. In the silence that followed, Deja took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady her emotions. She had no desire to escalate things further. Not now, not in front of the other officers. But she would not leave without making her point. She would not let him have the last word. The minutes dragged on as Thompson finally put his coffee cup down, his earlier smugness giving way to something else, something that almost resembled wariness. He looked at her again, more carefully this time, as if seeing her for the first time. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice lacking its previous bravado. "Deja Carter," she replied coolly, watching the subtle shift in his expression. "And you just made a very big mistake. You want respect," Thompson said, his voice low. "Then maybe you should learn where you stand. You're in my world now." He grinned cruelly, his eyes gleaming with malice. Deja knew what was coming before he even made the move. He was trying to intimidate her, trying to put her in her place. She stood her ground, not flinching, not moving an inch, even as he leaned forward, his grip on the coffee cup tightening. The realization hit him a second too late. The woman he had just assaulted wasn't some random civilian. She wasn't just another complainer walking into the station. No, Deja Carter was about to become something far more significant in his world. In that moment, Thompson had no idea that the woman standing before him wasn't just a victim of his cruelty. She was the storm he had just awakened. And by the end of this, everyone in the room would know exactly who Deja Carter was. But for now, Deja stood there, her dignity intact, knowing that the real story was only just beginning. Unmasking the truth. The seconds dragged on as the silence in the room thickened, becoming almost unbearable. Deja stood her ground, the sting of the coffee still burning on her skin, but she ignored it. The sensation was nothing compared to the fire building inside her chest, a fire that wasn't fueled by the physical pain but by something much deeper, something that threatened to ignite and consume everything in its path. Thompson sat across from her, his once cocky expression now twisted with uncertainty. He glanced at the other officers, who, until now, had kept their distance, either too scared or too indifferent to intervene. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The weight of Deja's words, the quiet power in her demeanor, was slowly beginning to dawn on everyone present. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in. Thompson's bravado cracked like glass, and he looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the image of the helpless civilian he had expected her to be. He had underestimated her, and he knew it now. But it was too late. Deja wasn't the kind of woman who would let someone get away with treating her this way. Not when she had spent her entire career fighting for respect, for justice, for equality. "Is that it?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of steel. "You're just going to sit there and stare at me?" Thompson's eyes darted around the room, seeking reassurance from his colleagues. But no one spoke, no one moved. Deja's presence was like a storm cloud hanging over them all, and they could feel it. They could feel the shift in power. And Thompson knew that the moment he had crossed that line, there was no going back. "Look, I don't know who you think you are," Thompson began, his voice less certain now, more defensive, "but you need to understand that." Deja interrupted him with a quiet but forceful laugh, one that sent a shiver down his spine. "I'm not here to listen to your excuses, Thompson. I came here to report a crime, but it seems like you had something else in mind. What you don't realize is that your actions are about to cost you far more than just a bruised ego. So, unless you want to make this situation worse, I suggest you stop talking." Thompson opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. He was already realizing, too late, that he had made a grave mistake. Not only had he assaulted someone in his own precinct, but he had done so with a complete lack of awareness of who he was dealing with. Deja took a step closer to the desk, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm not your average civilian," she said, her tone low but powerful. "In fact, I'm not even just another officer. I'm your new boss." For a moment, there was a stunned silence that fell over the room. The words hung in the air, unspoken disbelief filling the space between them. Thompson blinked, his face draining of color as he tried to process what she had just said. He glanced at the other officers, searching for a reaction. Any sign that they were playing some kind of cruel joke on him. But no one spoke. No one laughed. The truth was settling in, slow and deliberate, like an iron fist wrapped in velvet. "Did you what?" Thompson stammered, his voice shaky now. You can't be. You're not." "I am," Deja replied firmly, her voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'm the new chief of police, and you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Thompson's face turned red as he sputtered for words, but none came. His mind raced, scrambling to make sense of what Deja had just revealed. He had no idea that the woman standing in front of him, the one he had so easily dismissed, was the very person who would soon hold the power to change the direction of the entire department. He had no idea that she was the one who would hold him accountable for every wrong he had ever committed. Deja could see the panic rising in his eyes, the realization slowly dawning on him like a wave crashing onto the shore, pulling everything out from under him. It was almost satisfying, watching him squirm. But Deja wasn't here for satisfaction. She was here for justice. "You think this is a joke, Thompson," Deja's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable steel edge to it. "I'm the one who will be overseeing every decision you make from now on. Your career, your future, everything is in my hands. And the way you've treated me today, that's going to cost you." The other officers in the room were beginning to stir, their discomfort palpable. Some were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others were watching the exchange with wide eyes, caught between fear and fascination. They had all heard rumors about the new chief, about the woman who was about to take charge of the department. But no one had expected this. No one had anticipated that the woman who would be leading them would walk into the station with such quiet authority, demanding respect, and making it clear that she would not tolerate any kind of disrespect, especially not from someone like Thompson. "Deja, I didn't know," Thompson said, his voice faltering. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking. I thought you were just another." "Another what?" Deja asked, her eyes narrowing. "Another complainer. Another woman trying to take up space in a man's world." She paused, letting the question hang in the air, watching as Thompson's face flushed with shame. "You don't get to make those assumptions about people, not when you're in a position like yours." "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it," Thompson mumbled, his words barely audible now. Deja shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "Apologies don't fix this, Thompson. Your actions have consequences, and I'm going to make sure those consequences are felt." At that moment, the door to the precinct's back office creaked open, and the lieutenant, a middle-aged man named Carl Dawson, stepped out. He had been standing behind the scenes, listening to the exchange with increasing unease. He had heard the commotion from his office, and the last thing he wanted was to get involved in a situation that could spiral out of control. "What's going on here?" Dawson asked, his voice a mix of concern and authority. Deja turned to face him, her demeanor calm but assertive. "I was just about to leave, but Thompson here thought it was a good idea to throw hot coffee in my face. I'm sure you can imagine how that might be an issue." Dawson's eyes widened in shock, his gaze flicking from Deja to Thompson, who had now turned pale and was staring at the ground, avoiding everyone's gaze. "Thompson," Dawson said, his voice low, "is this true?" Thompson mumbled something incoherent, but Dawson didn't need an answer. He could see the truth in the way the other officers were looking at him, the disbelief, the shock, and most of all, the disgust. "Get your things, Thompson," Dawson said, his voice sharp now, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "You're suspended, effective immediately. I'll handle the rest." Thompson's face crumpled, his hands shaking as he gathered his things, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved. Deja watched him leave, the tension in the room finally beginning to break. As the door slammed shut behind him, Deja exhaled, her shoulders finally relaxing. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. But today, she had made her point. Today, she had taken control of her future. And Thompson, he had just made a fatal error. The reckoning. Lieutenant Carl Dawson stood in the doorway of the back office, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of trepidation and disbelief. He had heard murmurs in the department about Deja Carter, the new chief of police, the woman who was going to shake things up. But nothing had prepared him for the force of nature standing before him now, her calm demeanor masking an undercurrent of pure determination. Dawson's eyes flicked from Deja to Thompson, who was still sitting at the desk, his face a shade of red that seemed to come and go in waves. The other officers in the room, once silently complicit in their own discomfort, now looked between their lieutenant and the new chief, sensing the shift in the air. The room, once buzzing with idle chatter, had fallen silent. Tension hung like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. "Is there a problem here, Thompson?" Dawson's voice cut through the stillness, low and deliberate. Thompson, still trying to recover from the shock of Deja's revelation, didn't immediately answer. His gaze darted between Dawson and Deja, as if looking for an ally, but there was none to be found. Dawson's gaze was fixed on Deja, his brow furrowing as he processed what had just transpired. He hadn't been privy to the specifics of her appointment or the full extent of the changes she planned to bring, but he had heard the rumors. And now, watching the way she held herself, he knew those rumors weren't just idle chatter. "There's no problem, Lieutenant," Thompson finally muttered, his voice tinged with embarrassment. I made a mistake. A big one." Dawson raised an eyebrow, but said nothing for a moment. He turned his gaze back to Deja, sizing her up for the first time. What he saw wasn't just a woman. It was a leader, someone who commanded attention, someone who could take control of a room without saying a word. And for a split second, Dawson felt a pang of regret for the officers in the room, including Thompson, who had failed to recognize that power. "I see," Dawson said, stepping further into the room and crossing his arms. "Well, Chief Carter, if you don't mind, I think it's time we had a little chat about what just happened here." His eyes flicked back to Thompson, who was still sitting there, eyes lowered, trying to avoid Deja's gaze. "We can't have this kind of behavior in this department." Deja took a slow breath, her gaze unflinching as she met Dawson's eyes. There was no malice in her expression, only resolve. "You're right, Lieutenant. We can't have this kind of behavior. But I'm not just going to let it slide. Not this time." Dawson, though more measured in his approach, could see that Deja wasn't making idle threats. She wasn't here to simply fill the role of chief and let things fall as they may. No, she was here to lead, to change things from the inside out. And that was exactly why Thompson had just made a colossal mistake. He had thought Deja was just another woman he could push around, but now the consequences of his actions were beginning to unfold before him. "Thompson." Deja's voice was low, but there was an undeniable weight to her words. "Do you understand what you've just done? You've assaulted me. And that's not something we can just overlook. This isn't just a minor infraction. You've crossed a line that will have consequences for both you and this department." Thompson opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no defense. He had no excuse for what he had done. The once confident officer who had seen himself as above reproach was now a man trapped by his own arrogance. He had no idea how deep the repercussions of his actions would reach. "I don't know what you're expecting, but it's not going to be a slap on the wrist," Deja continued, her voice steady and unwavering. "I've worked too hard to get where I am. I've fought for respect in a system that wasn't designed for me, and I will not tolerate anyone undermining the integrity of this department. Not from you, not from anyone." The other officers were silent, some glancing nervously at each other. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when the new chief made her presence known. And it was clear now. Deja Carter wasn't here to play politics. She was here to demand accountability. Dawson watched the interaction closely, but he didn't interrupt. He knew Deja didn't need his help in this moment. She had everything under control, and Thompson's discomfort was proof of that. This wasn't about gender, race, or position. This was about respect, and Deja Carter had earned every ounce of it. After a moment, Thompson finally looked up, his eyes filled with an almost desperate pleading. I didn't know, Chief. I swear. I was just what?" Deja cut him off, her voice sharp. "Just being a bigot. Just being a bully because you thought I wouldn't be able to stand up to you." Thompson's mouth opened and closed, but the words wouldn't come. He was stuck in the weight of his own ignorance, unable to explain or defend himself. The shame was evident on his face, and though it should have been enough to satisfy Deja, there was a deeper satisfaction that came from watching him finally understand the gravity of his mistake. Deja took a step forward, her eyes not leaving his. "Your apology doesn't mean anything to me, Thompson. You've shown me exactly who you are. And that will be the story I tell the department. The officers who have witnessed this, who have seen how you treat people, they'll be the ones to decide your future here, not me." Thompson recoiled slightly, realizing the truth of her words. He had crossed a line, and now the consequences were no longer in his hands. He had humiliated himself, And now Deja would ensure that everyone in this department knew exactly what kind of man he was. He had believed he was untouchable, that his rank and his history within the department gave him some kind of shield. But that shield had just shattered. Deja turned to Dawson, who had remained quiet, allowing the tension to play out. "Lieutenant, I'll be filing an official report, and I expect you to be on board with this." Her eyes were steady, unblinking. There was no room for negotiation. "We will be reviewing every detail of Thompson's conduct from here on out, starting with this incident. And I'm sure I don't need to remind you about the kind of behavior we will no longer tolerate in this department." Dawson nodded slowly, his expression hardening with the weight of what was about to unfold. He knew Deja was serious. He could see it in her eyes. The time for sweeping things under the rug was over. Deja was going to expose the ugliness of the department's old ways, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "I understand, Chief," Dawson said, his voice grave. "I'll support whatever decision you make." Deja nodded once, her eyes returning to Thompson. "You're not going to get away with this. Not this time." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Thompson's face flushed a deeper shade of red, his body stiffening as he realized that his career, his reputation, was about to come crashing down around him. It wasn't just the scalding coffee that had burned him. It was the realization that he had underestimated the power of the woman standing before him, and he would soon learn just how costly that mistake had been. The officers in the room slowly began to stir, some exchanging glances, others staring at the floor. There was no going back now. The balance of power had shifted, and Deja Carter had taken her first step toward reshaping the department in her image. This was only the beginning, the unraveling. The days following the confrontation in the precinct were filled with whispers. The station had always been a place of secrets, dirty little truths that no one ever dared speak out loud. But now there was an undeniable shift in the air. The quiet whispers of the new chief were no longer just about her appointment or the changes she promised. Now they were filled with curiosity, fear, and awe. The officers in the station were walking on eggshells, unsure of what to expect next. But one thing was clear: Deja Carter was not the woman they had imagined. Thompson's humiliating encounter with her had rippled through the department like a tidal wave, crashing against everything in its path. He had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. But that wasn't the worst of it. The truth of his actions, his racism, his cruelty, was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was exposed for everyone to see. Officers who had once been too afraid or indifferent to speak out now found their voices. The culture of silence that had long defined the precinct was crumbling, piece by piece. Deja sat behind her desk in her new office, the weight of the day's events still heavy on her shoulders. She stared out the window, watching as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. This was what she had fought for: a chance to lead, a chance to change things. But as she had quickly learned, leadership was never easy. It came with sacrifices, with battles, both seen and unseen. And her battle had only just begun. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, seeing the name Lieutenant Dawson on the screen. She had been expecting his call. "Chief Carter," Dawson's voice was respectful but tense. "I've just received word from the Internal Affairs Department. They've finished reviewing Thompson's case." Deja's jaw tightened. She had known this day would come. She had anticipated the politics, the maneuvering that would follow such a public incident. But she had no intention of letting the department sweep Thompson's actions under the rug. "Tell me, Dawson," she replied, her voice calm, though there was an edge to it. "What's the official recommendation?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a deep sigh. "They're recommending a suspension, Chief, with pay. And after the suspension ends, he'll be reassigned to desk duty for the next 6 months." Deja's grip on the phone tightened. She had known that Thompson would not be immediately fired. This was a police department, after all, where accountability was often a luxury reserved for the few. But she had expected more than just a slap on the wrist. A suspension with pay. It was almost laughable. "That's not enough," she said, her voice steady but laced with disappointment. "Thompson assaulted me. He disrespected the badge, the department, and everything we stand for. We can't just let this slide." Dawson was silent for a moment. He knew Deja was right, but he also knew how the system worked. He had seen enough to understand that the department was slow to hold its own accountable. The thought of crossing that line, of truly calling out one of their own, filled him with unease. "I understand your frustration, Chief," Dawson said finally, "but you need to understand the politics here. This could escalate quickly. The union is already backing him. He's a veteran officer, and there's a lot of support for him behind the scenes." Deja let out a slow breath, her eyes narrowing. "Politics? Is that what this is about, Dawson? Politics?" She stood up from her desk, pacing the room, her mind racing. She had been prepared for this moment. The moment when the system would try to protect its own, when they would try to bury the truth beneath layers of bureaucracy and power plays. But she had never been one to back down, not when it came to justice. "This isn't about politics," Deja said, her voice gaining strength. "This is about integrity. About doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Even when it means challenging the very institution you're trying to change." Dawson was quiet again, as if considering her words. Deja's passion, her unwavering sense of justice, had always been a part of her. But now, as chief of police, she was learning that it wasn't enough to just be right. She had to fight for what was right, against the systems that had been in place for decades, against the biases that had been allowed to fester. And sometimes, fighting for what was right meant standing alone. "I'm not going to back down, Dawson," she continued, her eyes flashing with determination. "I'm going to make sure Thompson pays for what he did. He's not going to get away with this, and I'll take whatever fallout comes with it." Dawson exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, there was a trace of reluctance in his voice. "I'll do what I can to support you, Chief, but you should know, there will be repercussions. This isn't just about Thompson anymore. It's about the department, about how we handle discipline and accountability. You'll be stepping on a lot of toes." "I'm prepared for that," Deja replied firmly. "If I have to step on toes to ensure that justice is done, then so be it. I didn't come this far to play nice with people who protect the guilty." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and Deja could hear Dawson's deep breath. "I'll notify Internal Affairs that you want a second review of the case," he said, "but I can't promise they'll change their recommendation." "I'm not asking for promises," Deja said, her voice unwavering. "I'm asking for action." After hanging up, Deja sat back down at her desk, her mind swirling with thoughts of the fight ahead. This was only the beginning. Thompson's actions had already caused a ripple effect through the department, but it was clear that the consequences of this moment went far beyond just him. This was about the culture of the entire department, about the men and women who wore the badge, and whether or not they were ready for real change. As the night stretched on, Deja found herself working late into the hours, drafting a public statement, preparing to meet with the press, and reviewing the internal review process. She knew the coming days would be filled with challenges, public scrutiny, pressure from the union, backlash from those who had supported Thompson for years. But she had always known that true leadership required standing firm when the pressure mounted. And she was ready. The next morning, Deja addressed the entire department during the roll call. Her presence was commanding as she stepped into the room, her voice clear and unyielding. "We are no longer tolerating the culture of silence and complacency," she began, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of every officer. "We will hold each other accountable. We will do what's right, not what's easy. And anyone who can't meet those standards will be held responsible for their actions." The room was silent. No one spoke, but Deja could feel the weight of their eyes on her. She knew that some were uncomfortable, some were angry, But it didn't matter. Change had come, and it wasn't going away. It was time to start rebuilding. Time to restore the department's integrity. And if some people didn't like it, well, they would have to decide whether they could respect the badge or leave it behind. Deja took a breath, her voice firm as she added, "This is your warning. We're here to serve justice, and I will be watching." The silence that followed was thick, but in it, Deja heard something else, an unspoken understanding. Things were about to change. The transformation. The days following Deja's decision to push for a second review of Thompson's case felt like a battleground. The department was in turmoil. Officers were whispering in corners. The union was rallying behind their disgraced colleague, and those who had once turned a blind eye to the culture of unchecked power in the precinct were now starting to feel the pressure. Deja had stirred the pot, and now it was boiling over. But she wasn't backing down. Each morning she arrived at the precinct, her resolve only grew stronger. She knew that the path she was choosing was fraught with resistance, but it was the path she had always been prepared for. She had spent years working in an environment where she was told she didn't belong, fighting for recognition in a world that was determined to silence her. But now she was the chief of police, and her responsibility was not just to her career. It was to the community she served, to the officers who believed in her, and to herself. Justice had to prevail. Deja's office had become a hub of activity. Meetings were scheduled back-to-back. Phone calls from city officials and lawyers were frequent, and Dawson, always the cautious lieutenant, kept a close eye on her, offering support when he could, though still wary of the consequences. The city council had been flooded with messages of both support and backlash. Some called her a hero, others a troublemaker. But what mattered most was that her voice was being heard. The Internal Review Committee, however, wasn't moving as swiftly as Deja had hoped. Weeks passed with little progress, and the union's influence on the department became more apparent every day. Thompson was still on leave, still collecting pay, and still being supported by many of his fellow officers. The quiet whispers that had followed her into the office now spread like wildfire, turning into louder conversations, debates, and eventually, outright opposition. Deja knew the stakes were high. The department was entrenched in a culture of protecting its own. But this wasn't just about Thompson anymore. It was about proving that leadership, no matter your gender, race, or background, could bring about real change in an institution that had long been set in its ways. One afternoon, Deja stood at the front of the precinct's briefing room, addressing the officers in the most important meeting of her career. The room was filled with both veterans and rookies, the tension palpable. The air was thick with uncertainty. Many eyes were cast down, others were filled with skepticism, and a few were hopeful. "Officers," Deja began, her voice strong and unwavering. "I've spent a lot of time listening to what's been said about the situation with Thompson. I've heard the gossip, the accusations, and the defenses. But the truth is, there's only one thing that matters here: accountability." The room fell silent. Every eye was on her now, no longer distracted by their phones or each other. This was a woman who wasn't just talking about change, she was demanding it. "I've worked hard for this position. I didn't get here because I was a token. I didn't get here because someone thought I'd make things easier or more comfortable. I got here because I fought for my place, because I showed that I had the strength, the skills, and the integrity to lead. And if any of you are here for the same reasons, you will understand that the way things have always been done is no longer good enough." A few officers shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Some nodded slowly, others were still processing her words. Deja's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of every officer in that room. She could feel the weight of the history she was up against, the weight of an institution that had long operated in secrecy and self-preservation. But this moment was different. She was different. "I'm not going to pretend that change is easy. I'm not going to sugarcoat the truth for you," she continued, her voice steady. "But what I will do is hold each and every one of you accountable, not just for what happens outside these walls, but for how you treat each other, how you respect the badge, and how you treat the community we serve. The officers exchanged more looks. Some looked uncomfortable, others were visibly skeptical, but a few were nodding, a sense of agreement beginning to form. "The days of looking the other way are over," Deja said, "and I'll make sure of it. The investigation into Thompson isn't just about one officer. It's about all of us. It's about how we move forward as a department. It's about whether we will stand for what's right or continue to hide behind the excuses that have allowed this kind of behavior to thrive." Deja paused, letting the words sink in. She could feel the weight of the moment. She knew she was making enemies in that room, but she also knew that those who would stand with her would be the ones who truly believed in the values they had sworn to uphold. "And make no mistake," she said, her voice hardening. "If you think that the old ways will continue under my leadership, you're wrong. You will be held accountable for every action, every word, every decision. We don't get to pick and choose when to do the right thing. We do it every single day." The room remained silent for a moment, the officers digesting her words. Then, slowly, one by one, they stood. The older officers, the ones who had been around long enough to remember the previous administration's leniency, were still hesitant. But the younger officers, the ones who had come into the department with a desire to make a real difference, they stood up first. Their applause was hesitant at first, but grew stronger as the room began to fill with the sound of genuine support. Deja stood there, holding her ground, as the clapping echoed around her. She wasn't just chief of police in that moment. She was a symbol of everything the department could be if they dared to change. As the meeting ended, Deja walked back to her office, the weight of her decision settling in. She had challenged everything. She had pushed the department, and the people in it, to face the truth about themselves. The power of this moment was undeniable, but Deja knew the real work was only just beginning. Back at her desk, her phone buzzed again. It was Dawson. "Chief," his voice sounded more serious than usual. "We've got an update from Internal Affairs. The review board is recommending Thompson be placed on permanent suspension without pay. They're also pushing for him to be removed from the department entirely." Deja leaned back in her chair, letting out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like the tide had finally started to turn in her favor. But the true victory wasn't just in Thompson's fate. It was in the officers who had witnessed the transformation in the department, who had seen Deja hold her ground and demand accountability. This was a new chapter for the department, one that had the potential to rewrite the narrative of what it meant to serve and protect. And as Deja looked out over the city, she knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she was certain of one thing: change was coming, and it was coming with her at the helm.